Hello, Daz. How you doing today, mate?
How's it going? How you going? I'm good. I'm good.
Excellent. Yeah, very well, very well. Good to have you on. The first question I ask all the people who've been kind enough to come on a podcast is, why do you do what you do, and how has it influenced what you're currently doing?
Okay, well, I guess I've always enjoyed coaching, but if I'm truly honest, my passion has always been in more coach education. So I think I got my thirst for that at university, where I got as much of a thrill out of helping my friends improve in their grades as much as it was about me trying to get the best grade I could. So that was something that really got me going. And as soon as I had the opportunity to become a professional coach, it didn't take me long to realize that what I really wanted to do was um, have an impact in helping some of the less experienced coaches coming through. So that's probably reflected in my business now and my role as the owner of Athletic Performance Academy, because I guess a big part of what I do as the owner is actually to recruit and train staff that basically represent myself ultimately, and then my reputation, and then obviously the values of the company. So yeah, that's really kind of what keeps me involved now, is that coach education.
And in terms of the people who work for you, reflecting the values that you hold true, what do you value at Athletic Performance Academy, and how has your coaching or your experience led you to those values?
Yeah, well, um, I think most organizations, certainly the ones that are in the corporate world, will have mission statements and values and everything else. This was something that I can't take complete credit for, because we did have a sports psychologist that worked at one of the tennis academies that APA is very much aligned with. And we went through some exercises on how to come up with values. And at APA, I, I kind of took some of the ones that I liked from the tennis academy and some of the ones that resonated with me. But the idea is that I'm, and it will probably feed into when we're talking about philosophy, is that I want to coach people first, athletes second, and tennis players third. And I know that sounds a bit cliche, but it really is important to me that we are developing people. And one of the ways that you can do that is through coaching through values, rather than always thinking about just technical information. So the values that I have at APA, not necessarily in order of importance, but
Yeah.
excellence. Excellence is the first one. Respect is the second one. Courage is the third one. Competitive spirit is the fourth one. And then the last one is enjoyment. So these are the kind of five values. And then really what I try and do when I'm coaching the coaches is to get them to think about what are the behaviors that they're going to embody in themselves that bring those values to life. And then also, how would they expect the athletes that they're working with to model those behaviors? And I have to say that it does vary from year to year, as you can imagine, depending on the nature of the athletes you're working with. Um, but I would say I spent as much, if not more, of my time coaching values about how to respect themselves, their competitors, and then the training process, more than perhaps a lot of the technical information, because they've got to be ready to listen, and they've got to be ready to want to do the training that is truly required to be a world class player, and that takes time to educate them on how to go about that. And yeah, I don't live in this kind of romantic world where I believe that everyone that gets to the top is the most professional,
Yeah.
but you have to aspire to try and create that culture with all of your coaches and your athletes. And that excellence one and that respect element, they're the ones that really resonate with me. But then, you need a lot of courage to keep staying true to the path, even when you're not getting things going your way. And for me as well, enjoyment is one that I have to really work on myself, because what I find enjoyable about the process of getting better as an athlete might be different to the next person. So you have to resonate with why people keep turning up at 8 o'clock in the morning to do the training, and what they find enjoyable. It's really important that I understand what makes them tick and what they enjoy about training. So that's another important one. So yeah, I do my best to make sure that we live these values, because otherwise it's just something you write on a bit of paper and you never talk about it again.
Yeah, and I think you always touch on a good point there, because it's easy. Most coaches, or maybe just speaking from experience. So as a failed athlete myself, it's almost easy to naively assume that what motivated you then motivates your athletes, which, as you said, is not always the case. In your role of developing coaches, how do you go about assessing them as a coach? Because you've obviously said these values are important. Obviously, technical expertise will come into it somewhere, but do you have a framework for assessing them, or is this sort of an ongoing process?
Yeah, well, I guess you could say there's a formal and then there's an informal version of it. So if I was doing a formal mentorship, like, stroke internship, if you want to call it that, and someone was actually coming in specifically to get feedback on their coaching, I have a more formal approach where there's lots of questions that I ask them about their beliefs about certain things. And obviously, each of the questions relates to one of those values. So if I was talking about excellence, it might be something like, how important is it for you and your athletes to arrive on time? And it's just a conversation starter, because what I believe to be excellent and what it should look like might be coming from a completely different place as you. I have never been in the military, but I aspired to join as an officer until I was 18 years old and realized that I was not quite going to be able to do that because I was colorblind, I had poor vision and a few other things. But that type of discipline of like being rigorously relentless in being on time and doing everything like clockwork is very easy for me to grasp, because that's what I see the world as looking like at the professional level. But having been around elite athletes, I know that there's a lot of athletes that are at the very highest level who would not necessarily see that as what excellence looks for them. They would associate it with what they can do on the tennis court as excellence, being a few minutes late, or not dressing immaculately, or something else might not be in their world. So you have to find out what's important, and there's certain non-negotiables. Like I will not have any coach swear in front of my cohort of athletes, and I don't care where their background is and whether it's acceptable in another situation. There's certain non-negotiables that I'm just like, look, that's not happening. Because excellence for me is that you speak to them properly and articulately, and if you're going to swear, that's just not acceptable to me. But there'll be other things where if I'm like 5 minutes late, that means I've arrived on time to other people.
Yes.
And it's like, but I have to pick my battles, because is it negotiable? Well, no, you need to be there on time, you need to be dressed appropriately, and you're going to talk properly. But other things like, what does excellence mean? Do the children have to be silent when you're talking and standing still? Well, in my world, I'm a little bit more militant, but other people, they get really good outcomes because they're very personable and relatable and talkative and take a lot more interest, and perhaps have a slightly more friendly approach to the way that they interact with them, whereas I'm a bit more like at arm's length. But you know what I mean? So you have to, the way I measure it is I have, going back to your original question, is I have a series of observation checklists and also questions that I can get my coaches that are new to me to fill in, so I know where they're coming from. So I get to know them, because I think you need to invest time in knowing your athletes and knowing your coaches. And so it's an easy way to do it is, I know it's a paper exercise, but you can also ask them, and you can get to know these things by spending time with them. But I do that formally, and then informally as well. I make the effort to watch their sessions, and for them to watch mine, and then I just try and kind of think about what are the things that can be chunked up, so that it doesn't matter what background you've come from, whether you're from rugby or whether you're from a combative sport or a more of a creative, like artistic sport, like where the culture is very different. What are the things that we can all agree on that need to happen in order for that session to be successful? How can we chunk it up? So excellence might be that the children are listening, because it means that they respect you. So if they're not listening, they ultimately don't respect you. They need to be learning something, because excellence is about coaching. And then obviously related to that, they need to be having fun. So that relates to enjoyment, because if they're not listening, they're not learning, they're not having fun, then in my opinion, that's an ineffective coaching environment. But how do you get the children to listen and to learn and to have fun is more up for grabs, because I know that my militant style is not going to work for quite a lot of coaches, because it's not authentic to them. So I don't necessarily expect them to model my specific personality traits and behaviors, but the outcomes need to be there. And that's how we coach through values, because that's how we can chunk it up. Because I think we can agree at the highest level of, I think everyone agrees kids need to be listening. We want them all to be learning. Otherwise, we're just babysitting. And they need to have fun. Otherwise, they don't come back. But, you know, we might need to negotiate what that means for different people and different coaches. And that's the interesting part. That's why I always say, coach the person first. And I really try and make sure we do that.
And I love the way you've almost brought that full circle in terms of what you believe, but how that's sort of, there's going to be stuff which you believe fundamentally to be true. There's going to be other stuff where, as you said, you're not going to have coaches model your exact behavior because there's a bit of wiggle room. In terms of understanding yourself as a coach and the athletes in front of you, how do you encourage the coaches who work for you how do you encourage them to develop self-awareness in terms of what they're like on, say, a good day, a bad day? I know you've done a lot of I know you've looked into a lot of Brett Bartholomew's stuff. So if you could elaborate on how you develop your awareness of yourself as a coach and how that's impacted your coaching.
Yeah, well, I mean, my awareness obviously has come about through my own particular inner battles because as a student, one of the things that I found about university was that it played to my strengths, but it didn't really prepare me for the workplace, because I had a very good ability to critically appraise other people and to be able to write all these fantastic articulate assignments about coaching methodologies, but I hadn't really created the ability to form my own opinion. And one of the things that I always struggled with as a younger coach was I was a perfectionist, and I was always seeking things to be done in such a way, and I was very hard on myself. But one of the things that I try and help with the coaches that come into my space now is to get them to understand that, like, that I'm going to give them room to grow and to make mistakes and to learn through trial. But the main thing I do is I just give them honest feedback from the beginning, and I tell them, look, you might not be used to someone talking to you quite directly because it's not the British way, but I'm running a business, you're representing my company, and I need you to listen and respond to it, and I need you to understand it's coming from a safe place. I'm not trying to unsettle you, but I want to make you better, and the only way I can do that is if we have a candid, frank relationship where you know that you can, within reason and with respect, give me feedback on how I'm performing as your boss, but that works both ways, and I want to give you honest feedback. So I watch them and I tell them, and I also asked for their opinion first, because, you know, at the end of the day, I'm interested to see what their perception is, because if they think they've done a great session and in my opinion it wasn't, then that's interesting. And if I think they've done a great session and they think that they've done a bad session, that's also interesting. So get their opinion and then match pictures and do it quickly, because I think people are too worried about upsetting people and worried about what people think. And I was certainly, as a young coach, I was extremely worried about what people thought. And I think if you want to try and get somewhere faster, you need to just make sure that everyone feels safe, that they can give candid, frank, honest feedback, which goes both ways, but it has to be done with respect. That's why one of those values is important. And then get on with it, because I've got 20 years experience, and that doesn't mean I'm necessarily a better coach than them, but it means I've made more mistakes, and I've probably done something that they've already done, and I'll try and get them somewhere faster, because that's what my job is. So I think, yeah, just how many times do you get someone come up to your session, Todd, and go, right, would you like some feedback?
Yeah, not as often as I'd like. Not as often as I'd like.
So imagine that it's your company and everyone's got your name on their t-shirt. Then they're kind of like, it goes with the territory. I'm going to pay you to do a job, and I've picked you because I think you've got some good skills, and I'm also going to try and help you to be better. And as long as you're open for that and willing to listen to the feedback, then let's get cracking.
Brilliant. And you said there that in your younger days, you're almost worried to put stuff out there because of what people might think. And whereas now
Yeah,
you regularly writing blogs. I've seen your
yeah,
episodes of Daz DTV.
yeah.
How important is it for you that younger coaches who perhaps aren't as experienced almost don't let that stop them from putting stuff out there, which may or may not expose them to feedback that they don't like?
Yeah, I mean, it's critical. It's critical, and one of the things that, as I said, that made me have an enormous amount of stress when I first left uni was not feeling that I could say anything because I was worried about what people would think, and also I just in university I had such a long period of time to prepare each piece of work so that it was as good as I thought it could possibly be, and I genuinely didn't think I could say something or write something that perhaps was going to be any better in the next couple of days. Whereas when you actually go into the workplace and everything's moving so fast, you really can't kind of like, you know, procrastinate and worry too long about what you've just said, because everything's moving so fast. And I think you just got to be a lot more agile, a lot more kind of dynamic. And as long as, I always say to my coaches, as long as you've done the best you can that day, and tomorrow's a new day, and you might do something different, and that's fine. It's just like a moment in time, isn't it? And I think when you give that person that belief that it's just a moment in time, and as long as you did your best that day, then you might think something completely different in another week or another month or another year. And I could never get my head around that, because as a student I just couldn't possibly comprehend that you could think something quite different. And it's not to say that you're if you haven't if sometimes I think if you're prepared to change your opinion, you might be worried that you don't stand for anything.
Yeah.
But in my case, I've always felt that you can feel very strongly about something, and then there's nothing wrong with having your beliefs challenged and being open-minded to them, and thinking something differently down the line. I've certainly experienced that, and I'm questioning a lot of things that I'm happy to share with you. When we get into the philosophical conversation, because right now I've got some pretty deep-rooted coaching methods, and I'm questioning whether I think that that's the best way to help people improve. So if I can do that 20 years in, then I don't think there's a problem with someone who's questioning what they learned at uni like a year ago.
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned, or you alluded to the fact about being a bit of a perfectionist, and obviously
Yeah.
university moves perhaps a bit slower than the real world of work. Apart from being a perfectionist, or if you want to dive into that a little bit deeper, what do you think your harshest critic might say about you as a coach?
Yeah, well, it kind of relates to the perfectionism, which, by the way, I don't necessarily say is a good thing or a bad thing, but it just wasn't good for me,
Yeah.
because it kind of, rather than enabling me to strive for excellence, it disabled me, because I was never able to get started with anything, because there was such a massive fear response that it would never be right, it would never be good enough, and it would never be as good as X, Y, and Z coach. So it didn't enable me. The idea of doing your best and striving for excellence is different. So, but for me, what I had to do was just come at it from a completely different point of view. And I mean, could you just go back to what your original comments? I just lost my train of thought there about when you're saying.
It was about your what would your harshest critic say about you as a coach?
Yeah. So linked to that perfectionism, I think that I had such a need for structure, because it also linked to kind of certainty. I think that kind of, they go hand in hand, that perfectionism and need for certainty, that I really craved structure in everything, and everything needed to be quite black and white, and it had to be like. So I guess one of the things that I did in my coaching, throughout my coaching, is I've always sought to have quite rigid structures. And I suppose what that inevitably makes you do is become quite a reductionist coach that looks to uh, take everything down to its smallest denominator, so that you look at athleticism rather than as a complete whole. You look at it through a number of component parts, which I'm not saying is necessarily a flaw, because it helps you to make sense of the world. But I
Yeah.
think you then have to be able to understand that if you coach it, in such a reductionist, closed, stale way that potentially you might go down the wrong path. So I certainly felt that it was important to me, and it still is important to me to create structure within my thought processes. But when I originally did it, it came from a place of needing perfectionism and certainty, and wanting to be able to know that this is the way the world and the way athleticism is built. Whereas now I do it just to help me explain things in a more simple way for new coaches. But I do always have this massive caveat that, please, when I put these structures in front of you, like, and I'll talk about the philosophy in a second, I don't want you to think that that necessarily means that you're going to have to compartmentalize athleticism and break it down into these separate pieces, because in reality, you can't have one of those things without something else. You can't have strength without coordination. You can't have speed without balance. It's just a way for us to delineate the world so that we can make better sense of it. And I still like to simplify the world into these boxes, but I know I'm doing it now just to help say, hey, this is APA, and when we talk about speed, what I mean is this. Yeah. When I talk about strength, what I mean is this. Now, you might have been given some other information where your perception of this is different, but hey, when we're having a conversation around the table and I'm talking about speed, it includes these 3 or 4 or 5 main things. And so that's just kind of where I got. But yeah, as a critic, you'd probably say that I was quite rigid in my structure, and over the years now I've become more open to coaches being a little bit more not, I wouldn't say rigid, but just letting them express their ideas a little bit more creatively.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a good point there, because we spoke off air about certain people on social media who will be either this way or that way, and you saying how you fall somewhere in the middle. And ironically, even though you like things structured in terms of your thought processes on different parts of strength and conditioning, it's very much, fluid, shall we say. So you've mentioned your philosophy a few times. What is your philosophy when it comes to training athletes? And does that change at all when you're dealing with, say, a really young athlete?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the kind of the top level, I spoke to the idea, which I'm sure, other people have mentioned this, about the need to coach the person and then the athlete and then the tennis player, which is, for me, is important, because essentially I think a lot of coaches will say that you've got to coach the mental, the physical, the tactical, and the technical. So that's really my way of addressing the fact that I want to coach the mental and then the physical and then the technical. So, but I just happen to like the word coach the person, coach the athlete, coach the player. That works for me within my world. And then obviously, once you go a little bit deeper and you start looking at the actual physical domain of the athlete, so if we kind of focus on the athlete, then I think that any kind of sound philosophy needs to start with a needs analysis that's going to inform your strategy. So I think everyone that's went to university has been told that they need to do a needs analysis, which looks at the physiological, the biomechanical, and then perhaps like some kind of psychological, and then an injury prevalence piece. I think that's a given. But for me, my philosophy is, I'm trying to understand ultimately what are the power production demands of the specific movements of that sport, because ultimately I believe that when you really get down to it, you're trying to help the athlete produce the most amount of power in the actions that are relevant to their sport. So that's kind of where my start point is. But then in terms of my strategy, I'm really more of a general specialist, or specialist generalist, whatever you want to call that. So I believe that as far as it relates to tennis, it would be quite easy to start thinking very specifically about what tennis needs. And ultimately for tennis, I would say you need power endurance, right? So that might be where I'm trying to go. But as far as my philosophy about building the athlete from someone who's very young, who may or may not be going into tennis, I use the 5 S's, which Mel Siff was famous for talking about in Super Training, right? So I talk about suppleness, skill, strength, speed, and stamina. And those are my 5 pillars of athleticism. And so my philosophy is a generalist approach to developing a complete athlete who has got no physical limitations, who in theory would be capable of applying their body to any sport, and obviously over the course of a long-term athlete development plan, I've looked at each of those 5 physical factors, and I've developed a 6-stage pathway from kind of your youngest child up to the professional ranks. And obviously, as they get older and the tennis narrative becomes more and more important, I will then start to put more focus on which of those 5 S's are going to be most important, most critical for tennis. But I guess the other thing I would say, which is it always guides my philosophy, is what does the athlete need first, and then the needs of the sport second. Because I think we do get guilty of trying to like always put the sport first. And I think, you know, if you kind of have that concept of what does the athlete need, that's really important as well. So I know I've kind of waffled on a little bit
No,
there,
that's
but
great.
essentially it's the 5 S's with 6 stages of development. And I can talk about some of the aspects, but I'm sure you've got lots of other people that have given a good overview of like long-term athlete development. But I guess for me, the key things is, if you heard me mention earlier about the 5 S's, I probably would say movement efficiency is the most important like foundation. So in those earlier stages, you'll find the suppleness and the skill, and then the strength foundation will be more important. When you get to the kind of middle point of those 6 stages, so maybe like stages 3 to 5, where you're going just pre and then puberty and then post puberty, it's going to be more about that strength piece. And then obviously once we get to the last stage, that's where I really put the stamina under the spotlight. So it's, you know, if we're going to simplify things just to help people understand it, that's how I'd go: more suppleness and skill, and then coming into strength and speed, and then finally on top of that we're going to put the stamina. So that's kind of how I see building the complete athlete. And certainly for tennis, with what I regard is going back to that point about power, that power endurance, that's how I see tennis as well, is get the power first, and then that last piece, stage 6, is where we really build the endurance of that power.
One thing I want you to talk about a little bit more is I'm sure you've probably come across a lot of parents who will, for example, say, right, tennis might be a sport that could last however long it lasts, because there's no set time frame. So therefore I need to get my kid really, really fit. And they almost put that stamina, which you say is almost the last thing you focus on, or the power endurance, the last thing. Yeah. But then they put it at the forefront. What are some of the negatives or the dangers of doing that with, say, a young athlete?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the thing that I would stress, which this doesn't land for a lot of people sometimes, and it's maybe I need to figure out a better way to explain it, but these are just kind of the focus points. So you're always working on all of the components all of the time, right? So if you said to me, right, what do you mean by stamina? I'm talking about a very specific form of anaerobic energy provision for tennis, so power endurance. I want them to be able to produce explosive movements repeatedly, which is a very high-end quality, which is why I sometimes get a bit nervous of things like CrossFit with the kind of accustomed recreational athlete, because some of the things in there are extremely powerful movements done extremely repetitively, and I'm a bit like nervous, but that's probably another discussion, right? Yeah. So let's just say that that's the pinnacle of endurance. But there's other types of endurance. There's aerobic endurance, which could be something as simple as some steady cardiac output work to get your heart rate up to between 130 and 150 beats per minute for 20 minutes. And that could just be a bike ride, right? So if someone says like, well, what does endurance look like for your elite level athlete? Well, I just explained it's power endurance. It's like, it's repeated maximal effort leaping around the court, right? Where you're overcoming multiple times your body weight, and then having to attenuate even higher forces in order to land against that momentum that you've created. But if we're just talking about young children, then it looks different. And you're still working on endurance, but at stage 1, it's going to be more play, like games with evasion games, and that's going to get your heart rate beaten, but it's going to be a little bit more play in small areas. Then as you get to maybe the middle stage, it's going to be your traditional aerobic intervals, and then you're going to get eventually you're going to get into your anaerobic intervals, and eventually you're going to be doing it with like jumping, right? So with kids, I always say to them, it's just how you present it, and what I try to do with each of those 6 stages is give a interpretation of what that method will look like at that stage. And for a younger child, endurance is going to look different. Stamina, if I want to use that stamina, is going to look different for a child. So I'll do things that are going to tax the aerobic system, but they're still going to do things that might tax the anaerobic system because they play tennis, right? But that might be the main stimulus for them initially, is the sport, because they're already getting a good anaerobic, like intermittent type repeat sprint. So I might want to be putting more emphasis onto some other qualities that will augment that, such as strength. So it's just how you determine what you're focusing on at any given point in time. And my philosophy is a holistic approach where all of those 5 S's will be in the narrative from day one, all the time, forever and ever and ever. But it's just, what does it look like for a child, and what's the percentage of the time that you're working on? So how do you slice the pie?
Yeah. So just diving into your model a little bit more. So presumably, obviously, stage 6 is your professional tennis player, and stage 1 might be presumably somebody takes a prepubescent child to you, so really young.
Yeah.
Could you just go through the sort of 6 stages in a little bit more detail, or what ages you're looking at with each stage?
Yeah. So each of those 5 S's will have a framework where essentially I've selected the method that I think is most compatible and is the method that I would use the most. So I mean, I can just give you like an example of a particular subcomponent. Let's say we're doing speed, right? So within speed, I will classify 4 subcomponents. They all have to finish with the word speed because it's just how it needs to be.
Yeah.
So straight ahead speed would be like your linear speed. First step speed would be like your speed off the mark. Some people call that something different, but I call it first step speed. Multi-directional speed would be your classic agility. And then I've got something reserved that's very synonymous with tennis, what I call sport-specific speed. And in tennis, we would call that footwork.
Yeah.
Right. So I've got these 4 categories, and then within those categories, I will have now my 6 stages. So if I was looking at speed, stage 1 is typically more isolated movements. So you're learning the look, right? So if I was talking about straight ahead speed and I'm looking at acceleration, I might have something like a wall march. And then basic 2, I'm going to challenge that skill a little bit further, and I'm going to make it a bit more dynamic. So now, rather than them just being stationary against the wall, they're going to be doing maybe like a falling start. So they're going to be moving now over a distance of several meters. Basic 3, I want to challenge the complexity even further by having more decision making. So probably not such a good example for straight ahead speed because there isn't much decision making once the gun's gone off. But the principle of there being a decision or some kind of randomness to the execution of the task. So even in straight ahead speed, seeing as I've used this analogy, it could be that they are side shuffling, and then on a cue of the coach or of the opponent or of a ball, there is a 20-yard sprint to a defined area of the field. So that kind of thing. And then once I get to the next 3 levels, I call it advanced 1, 2, and 3. And advanced 1 is where I mainly use intensification, so more load. So straight ahead speed, it might be a heavy sled. Advanced 2, I want to put more emphasis on the velocity rather than the force. So that heavy sled might now become a light sled. And then advanced 3 is that endurance aspect, so speed endurance. So now you might be doing, if it's acceleration, it would be lots of volume of that. So there'd be lots of higher number of meters. And if it was top speed, then it would be just longer sprints. So that would be an example of just how I move things along. But the thing that I would want to stress from the beginning is that it's not like a child never gets to do a long sprint until they've absolutely nailed the wall march, because you'd have very bored kids and very bored coaches. So it's like it's something that I want the coaches to be aware of, so that they know what is the progression. Because as part of my philosophy, at the end of the day, I just want to gradually and progressively increase this training stimulus, right? That's all I want to do, because I genuinely believe that if you've got an athlete and you can increase their exposure to a stimulus that is going to make them adapt, eventually, of course, you need that training stimulus to be more specific to the demands of their sport, right? But essentially, that's how I go about things, with that minimal effective dose. What is the next level of stress that they need to improve? And so with a child, it might be that the coordination piece is the thing that gets them to that next level, is learning how to coordinate their limbs. But for someone who's already got the basic motor skill, and they might be a child, by the way, a young child that knows how to run, then I don't have a problem with them having a light resistance, even though that's an advanced method, because you just make it a light band rather than a heavy sled.
Yeah.
And, so you just have to take these progressions with a pinch of salt. But essentially, that's how I see things. And I just want the coaches to have an awareness of what something looks like that's got less stimuli and less stress, and something at the other end that's got more. And then you have to use your common sense to know how much of each of those things you want to give. And obviously, in an ideal world, a young stage 1 athlete is going to have more focus on movement efficiency and technical mastery and learn the basics. And you'd expect that an elite level athlete that's got more training history would need more intensification and more endurance of those qualities, because they're more robust. So
yeah, that makes perfect sense. I think I've certainly seen a lot of in strength and conditioning pyramids, and saying you've got to build this quality, then this one, and then this one on top. But as you said, it's I don't know where I'm stealing the analogy from, but almost like a Tetris block or a jigsaw puzzle, in the sense of you're putting this piece around this piece, but it's not that this piece is more important. It's just how they complement each other. How do you?
Yeah.
Oh, no, all I was going to say is obviously you've spoken through it or given detail about your model to speed. How do you incorporate deceleration? Is that under your change of direction model, or is this something you're, again, as you said, working alongside speed?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is the interesting thing, which is to answer your question, the deceleration aspect would be a part of the initial stage of multi-directional speed. So I think that you need to be working both sides of the coin from the beginning. I think you need to be working the gas and you need to be working the brakes. So in a car with a young child, I want them to be learning how to accelerate. So that's the gas. But obviously, I'm acutely aware that you need to teach the brakes. So these things will be happening simultaneously. If you were to push me and say there's one come before the other, most people would say you need to do the brakes first, because you wouldn't want to, drive a Ferrari out of the showroom with no brakes, right? But actually, if I'm truly honest, I do put quite a lot of emphasis in the beginning on first step speed and straight ahead speed, because I do think that a lot of children haven't actually fully developed that either. So I mean, they get pretty much equal attention, I would say, in my early phases. It's not like they just run and stop for hours and hours and hours, and then they've earned the right to then start sprinting around, because you're playing evasion games with them from day one. So they go in hell for leather from the beginning. It's just what they need. And of course, putting the brakes on is something that they learn as part of that multi-directional training system from the beginning. Yeah.
And you mentioned in your description of how you build speed and how that molds together about attacking things from the velocity end and maybe using either heavier sleds or lighter sleds. You recently did a blog article for Rob Pacey's podcast. So just want to chat a little bit about force velocity profiling. So what is force velocity profiling for those of you people who have not heard of it, and why might a coach want to use it?
Yeah, so from a training efficiency standpoint, as I kind of said at the beginning, like athleticism, ultimately most sports scientists and even kind of applied practitioners, coaches, I think are agreed that measuring and monitoring expression of force in short or relevant periods of time to sport is important. So essentially what we're interested in is power, because that's the expression of force in the time frames that are relevant to sport, right? So if we all agree that power is an interesting thing to measure, logic tells us is that if we can more accurately define how much force some athlete is capable of producing at various different velocities, it's going to be hopefully more it's going to be easier to optimally design their training, because you're going to be able to determine how much force somebody is able to produce at different amounts of velocity. And so if you know the velocities that are ultimately most important to your sport, so in tennis it's going to be different to rugby, it's going to be different to football, you can determine whether they're producing enough force at the velocities that the sport requires. And if you find that they are perhaps not producing enough force, which is quite common, or equally, they can produce a large amount of force slowly, but they're not able to produce that same amount of force at the speeds required for sport, then maybe they need to be working a bit more on their velocity. It just enables you to better pinpoint where you might be able to make the most effective use of their training time. And it's really kind of speaks to that individualization piece, which we all say we do, and I think we all to a greater or lesser extent actually do that. And one thing I would say is that that type of profiling is something that I don't necessarily do with my younger or less experienced athletes, because every day that they go in the gym, they're changing their parameters to some degree. So I'm more looking at that where I have an athlete who says that they've been training for several years, and maybe I don't know them, or maybe I think I know them and I just want to test my own assumptions. And then I want to know whether they produce how much force and at certain times that are relevant to sport, what happens there. So I just like to test my own opinions and assumptions about athletes. And I don't do it with a lot of the younger ones, because as I said, every time they go in the gym, they essentially feel like they're getting either more coordinated and or stronger. So it's like, it's something that I don't monitor as much. But with athletes that have been training for a while, it's something I like to do. And I'm still trying to get my head around JB Morin's research, because I've been using his squat jump protocol as well. So it's only obviously looking at the jump performance, but it gives you some kind of indication of how they produce force. And the research has been really helpful to create those force velocities. So yeah, we can talk about that, but again, it's something that I'm trying to get my head around as well.
And on the subject of JB Morin stuff, you said on the podcast and off the podcast, you're a specialist generalist. So if you could spend a block of time with one coach, observing them and their athletes, again, this doesn't have to be one coach forever, just maybe something that you're interested in of late, who would you choose to spend time with and why?
Yeah, well, I have spent time with both of these coaches. So I'm going to tell you why, because I personally wanted to be challenged a little bit. The first person that was continues to be influential on me, but Ian Jeffries, because he wrote a book called Game Speed, and I'd actually been picking his brains for quite a few years before that book came out. But he had always, in my opinion, had created that nice sweet spot between the structure that I was looking for but also when he saw him coach, it was very like clear that there was a lot of chaos with whatever group he was working with. It wasn't like what I expected to see. I'd read the book, I'd seen the structure, but he really was the person that made me see how you could work within the structure and surf that kind of curve, if you want to use the language, where you could be doing something that was quite static, but you could be doing something very dynamic, and it would happen in the same session, and even with like inexperienced athletes, because I just felt he did that very well. And every time I think about what a good speed session should look like with a large group of mixed ability people, I always think about the sessions that I used to watch him when I'd go and observe a few of his sessions at his university. So he was one person that I'd say go and check out, because he's a fantastic ex-professional athlete. He's got a ton of energy, and I think he creates the kind of session that I would want my coaches to be creating every day of the week. So yeah. He's a good person.
Yeah, I must say, having heard Ian Jeffreys speak at the UKSCA a couple of years ago and watched one of his talks at the NSCA, as you said, the energy he brings is brilliant, and it challenges a lot of traditional, shall we say, speed and change of direction programs. But it puts it nicely in the sense of it's not, you've got to learn it in a static environment, then you've got to integrate into the sport, and you can't do one till you've done the other. But as you said, the right balance of work going on. You recently spent some time with a strength and conditioning coach, Stefan Jones, who works predominantly in cricket. I've seen stuff, we chatted off air about the stuff we'd seen on social media. So my first question is, why is it important not to, for example, judge solely what you see on social media when it comes to forming an opinion of a training methodology? And the second part of the question is, we'll just chat about what you learned from spending time with him, or what made you want to go and spend time with him.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I kind of pride myself, and I say pride myself, but I think it's important that we always respect that context is king, right? So I could never really say for sure what the rationale is for anything I see on social media unless I've actually asked the person what the context is, because outwardly it might look like it just doesn't fit or doesn't make sense, or you might think, oh, that's just a really stupid exercise, but there might be a perfectly rational reason why they're doing it. And even if their philosophy perhaps outwardly looks like they're coming at it from a completely different place from you, if they can justify their philosophy and ultimately they're going to get results with it, then who am I to judge what the rationale is? So I do think context is king. You've got to know the background. I try not to make too many quick assumptions about why someone's chosen that exercise, and if I don't have that information. So I think that's the first thing, is you just got to be respectful, going back to my values of that people are putting something out there. You don't know what their rationale is for sharing it. Everyone's got their own reasons for sharing stuff, but I'm certainly not going to reach out to someone and criticize it without at least understanding the rationale. So, everyone does that to some greater or lesser extent. It's just not my thing. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't just throw someone under a bus and criticize them when I haven't even taken the time to know what the rationale is. And it might be a stupid exercise. It could actually be like a stupid exercise, but ultimately, I don't need to follow that person. And if I think that, do I? So.
And on the subject of that, obviously, so for context, I first came across Stefan's work on fast bowlers on Twitter. In terms of developing speed that's going to be seen on court, what are some of the mistakes that you see either with tennis coaches or S&C coaches trying to get on court when it comes to developing speed that will actually be seen in the context of the game?
Yeah, well, I'll try and kind of segue that to Stefan Jones if you want, because I didn't answer.
No, we didn't.
But the thing that got me interested in what he was talking about, and the reason why I went to visit him, but also to answer your question about how that relates to tennis, is he always struck me as someone that was going to measure his impact and his interventions by KPIs, so what I call like key performance indicators, that were most closely associated with the sport itself. So when I went to visit him and I was like, how will you truly know if your program is working? He'll go, because they bowl faster, Daz. I'm like, okay, that, even all of the things that I've tried to follow on your social media that confuse the hell out of me at times, that is just a very rational thing to judge your performance of your program by. And he goes, that's all I need to know is, and then the science is, what are the performance rate limiting factors that might cause someone not to be able to express their bowling speed. And therefore, that's the interesting question that he blew my mind with, because where he comes from is a completely different place where I was coming from. It was fascinating. But, you know, we can talk about that a little bit in a second. But as it relates to tennis, it's the same kind of thing. It's like, you know, you've got two main jobs as a strength and conditioning coach. You're trying to assist in maximizing performance on the sports field. And as I said, part of my philosophy is trying to determine those methods that are going to ultimately help to produce power in the tasks that you need in your sport. The question is to what degree do you get involved in a very specific application of that on the court? And where I stand is it does depend on your own limits of your capability. I've been in tennis for 15 years and been indoctrinated in the sport and have been surrounded by fantastic tennis coaches. I will never tell a tennis player how to hit a tennis ball. But what I will do is I'll be able to storytell in such a way that they're clearly seeing that what we're trying to do is improve the final skill of hitting a tennis ball. But I'm never going to talk to them about grips or racket paths or that kind of stuff. But I might get on the court and talk to them about their body position and their stance and their footwork, because at the end of the day, my observational checklist starts on the tennis court. If I'm ultimately going to have to judge whether my program is making them better on the tennis court, well, then the observation's got to start on the tennis court, not in the gym. It's got to start there. And so what I will do is I'll have an observation checklist where I want to see how they are moving on the court, because I just think it's so important. But whether or not I actually get on the court and how often is going to be based on my own expertise, the expertise of the tennis coaches, and our availability of resources. Because, you know, not many people have the luxury of being able to, you know, have a tennis coach and a physical trainer spend an hour on a court at the same time, because in most cases, who's paying for that? You know, unless you're employed by a governing body and you both work for the Lawn Tennis Association, it's not necessarily always feasible. But that for me is ultimately where the observation should start, because we can't get too romantic about the fact that everything that we do in the gym is going to improve performance, because it might be that it's just there to reduce the injury risk, and it might be that one of the things that we're doing is to help them to manage the training stress of the loads that they're putting on their body. But if you are trying to improve performance and that's your goal, then yeah, you should certainly start with the end in mind. And Stefan, bringing it back full circle, was very comfortable starting with the end in mind, and he would be talking about bowling speed, and he'd be talking about arm speed, and he'd be talking about run up distance and run up speed, and things that were all to do with the actual action of bowling. And he was less concerned with how strong they were on two legs doing a typical isotonic back squat, you know, with eccentric, isometric, concentric, because he's just like, that doesn't determine whether you're going to bowl fast. So, you know, loads of stuff in there. But for me with the footwork, it's not so difficult, because most S&C coaches are very uncomfortable with footwork and tennis. So most coaches are more happy not to get on the court. But the only thing I would say, if you do come across someone who clearly has a tennis background and they're wanting to kind of wear two hats, is just be cautious about how much you try and coach footwork consciously, because you can get paralysis by overanalysis. And I've seen a lot of S&C coaches that are well intended, and including myself in my early career, where I tried to talk them into how they move around the tennis court. And you just can't do it once you actually put the tennis ball in play. It just doesn't transfer. So you have to kind of recognize that what you're doing is only going to go so far. And then at some point, the tennis coach is going to have to be the person that helps to, to get that transfer.
And in terms of, I think I mentioned Paul Colbeck's work in contextual sprinting within football. So he talks about how, and it's kind of similar to Ian Jeffries in this, in the sense of, obviously you've got the physical qualities, but you need to be able to perceive what's happening in front of you in order to make an action. Do you see, or how do you see that something like that might be able to be related to tennis in terms of having the perceptual skills to understand where the ball's going to bounce and reading the opponent's body language?
Well, that's everything. That's everything in tennis. It's like, everything that makes a tennis player great at that sport is ultimately come down to the fact that they can consistently impact the ball at a certain point in time. And my observation checklist goes in such a way that I look at it mental, physical, tactical, technical, because I think the danger as sports coaches is that they will assume that every error is technical, right? But I don't want to sound like I'm, what's the word? I guess it feels like I'm perhaps saying one thing and then contradicting myself in the same breath. But yes, technique is everything, but there might be technical errors, but what caused them? And invariably, it's not the fact that they don't know how to hit the ball, but they've made a technical error. Why? And so my checklist is usually goes mental, physical, tactical, then technical, because invariably, one of the key things that people forget to observe is, were they actually trying their hardest? Right? Yeah. So, when we talk about person, athlete, player, person, were they focused and giving 100% effort? Because if they're not, I'm not even going to waste my time evaluating your performance. Because a lot of the coaches will say, I think there might be something here. They're not moving well. They're not doing this. Most of the coaches that I work with, because they're very experienced, will not be so naive to miss out the elephant in the room, which is they just don't care. They're not trying, right? But I think that's a good bit of advice for some coaches that are so concerned on the technical aspect. You go, hey, did you actually realize that they did not care what one bit about that drill? They were not engaged in that whatsoever. So why are you even trying to, think about what was the cause of the error? They just didn't try it. If they're focused and they're engaged and they're giving 100%, then I can look at the physical qualities on the court and I can go, right, did they have an athletic base? Did they have a good impulse, so off the ground? Did they use law of opposing forces, so they were reacting with the ground? Did they take large explosive first few steps? When they aligned with the ball, did they beat the bounce? So did they get there early rather than arriving just on time or late? Did they impact the ball above their waist and in front of their body, so they've got good spatial awareness and hand-eye coordination, all this kind of stuff? And then did they recover before their opponent hits the ball? And all you can start going into all these physical qualities. And then related to that, time and space is so important in tennis. So the tactical aspect is, did they know where to move to? Has anyone actually told them where to move into in relation to the baseline? Because you can appear slow on the tennis court, not only if you don't know how to move with proper efficiency, but you don't know where to move to. Maybe you don't recover to the right point, so you run too far, or you run to the wrong spot, so you appear to be slow, but you've just recovered to a place that's too far away. And then after all those things are in place, then you can start talking about the technique. Like, how did they use the kinetic chain, the technique of weight transfer, kinetic chain, energy transfer from the ground to the racket, the technique of the actual shot itself, which is where the sports coach comes in. So there's so much stuff there, and it's incredible. And if you think about all of those things, And then you go to the gym and you can determine whether they're actually strong or powerful and fit and
Yeah.
fast. But so much context on the tennis court that you need to really do a comprehensive assessment that, yeah, that's why I love the game. That's why I've been in it for 15 years, because it's not an exact science, and it's complex, but your job is to try and simplify it. That's why I love it.
And I think going back to right at the start of the podcast where you were talking about specifically defining terms and saying, when I speak about this in my world, it means this. I think that's so important, because you've just given an example of the athlete moving well around the court. And one thing strength and conditioning coaches, and again, I'm guilty of this, get caught up in, is we use what perhaps could be generic phrases. And when I say moving well as a strength and conditioning coach, I might mean, can they lunge, squat, hinge, push, pull? You say they're moving well on the court. That might be, as you said, do they recover well? Do they move into the space they're meant to? On that subject, and going back to the philosophy when working with youth athletes, we had a chat off air about David Epstein's new book and talking about the impact of early specialization. So you have some interesting thoughts about actually talented athletes not needing as much exposure to sport practice. Do you want to dive into a little bit of that now?
Yeah, so I'm not afraid of using the term talent. I know that you have to be careful about how you use that word, especially in front of children that you might be labeling, because labels are so critical. And when we talk about developing people, you've got to give everyone empowering labels, but at the same time, talent is one of those taboo words where a lot of people think that once they're labeled as talented, they stop trying all of a sudden, because they've got this kind of divine right to be an elite athlete. I'm certainly not saying that, but I just want people to be kind of aware of the fact that there is such a thing that, in my opinion, there are people who appear to pick up the particular motor skills of a sport quicker than other people. And I'm happy to call those people talented. I describe it a bit like download speed. If you're kind of not so talented, you might have that old kind of dial-up internet that takes you 5 minutes for it to come through. And the talented person, maybe they're running at 5G. So they only need to see it once, and they can basically imitate that straight away. And you're like, that is so unfair. How can you just execute that tennis serve and you've seen it once? I mean, I know I'm giving you a really over a simplification. It's not that simple, but that's how I look at it, is that there are people that just take less time to acquire the skills. And I genuinely believe that everyone is capable of getting to a certain level of performance that is maybe not expert level, but they'll be able to acquire the skill. What I'm saying is, I don't think that some children are capable of acquiring the skills fast enough to get on the bus.
Yeah.
I just think that, there's a finite amount of time by which someone has to achieve the expert level. And you can say, well, is there not a place for someone to be a bit of a slow burner and still achieve the highest level in the tennis game, having played it for 1 hour a week and just done it little and often? And I'm just like, well, you show me who that player is, and how many are of them that are genuinely not, what I'm going to say, specialized in a sport like tennis. Because I think that, people do need to invest a certain amount of time. And all I'm saying is that talented people, in my opinion, can maybe get away with spending a little bit less time than perhaps culturally we think in tennis you need to be in order to get to an expert level. I mean, motor skill learning has said that you need 10,000 reps to get the basics of a skill like a tennis serve. Maybe you need 100,000 reps to become excellent at it, and maybe you need 150,000 to become legitimate expert, right? That's a lot of reps. But I just think that some people who are more talented maybe don't need as much repetition to get the skill. And that for me is just something I've seen in experience. And no doubt everyone can get maybe better by doing more, but I think the more capable you are, the less you need to get to the same level.
Makes a lot of sense. And in terms of early specialization, it is a little bit of a buzzword in the strength and conditioning community. How do you define early specialization, and
Yeah.
why do you think that tennis is perhaps more of an early specialization sport than, I don't know, rugby or football or whatever sport you want to use as your example?
Yeah, well, I'll differentiate between the word specific and specialized training, because I believe that there is no problem whatsoever in turning up to a football academy or a tennis academy or a rugby academy and expecting to play tennis, football, or rugby. That's specific training for that sport. I mean, if I went to a tennis academy and I was playing football for the whole hour every week, there'd be something wrong, right? But that's specific training. Specialized training is where you only play that sport, full stop. So what I would encourage is that there is no problem with someone training specifically on a Tuesday when that's the night that they go to the tennis academy, and then to go and be doing things that are more specific, like playing football on the Thursday. I know that in reality this doesn't work quite like this, but that's what specific training is. Specialized training is where you only go to the tennis academy 5 days a week and you don't play other sports. So the question is do I think that specialized training is a problem? I think, globally speaking, we all know that if you overuse the muscles repeatedly, so you get this kind of pattern overload, you're more likely to have injury and you're more likely to have psychological burnout. So there are some problems with doing something repetitively in a sort of specialized manner. The question is that the nature of the beast? That do you still need to do that in order to become elite? Again, I would make the case that the more talented you are, the more likely it is that you could have a more diverse, enriched form of multi-sports type work for a longer period of time before you need to specialize. And I would also go further that if it's a sport like tennis, where I perceive it to be a very highly coordinated based sport, I think you're going to need more reps to master those techniques than, say, throwing a rugby ball and smacking someone with a tackle, which all the rugby people are going to be like, you've really just disrespected the sport. And I know that tackling is an extremely dangerous thing and you have to obviously master the art of tackling. But relatively speaking, you're using a lot of gross global muscles, whereas you're using a lot of fine motor skills for tennis. And I think, yeah, it's unquestionable that it's a highly, highly demanding, complex motor task. And I think you need to be practicing it earlier to get better at it. And, particularly in the female game, young women are getting to the top level. They might not be winning every tournament, but they're getting to the top level before they're adults, like 16, 17, 18 years old. So, yeah, I guess probably one other thing I'd say is it's early to specialize tennis, but it's late to realize. So you've got to start early, but you don't start winning at the top level until you are like in your mid-20s, right? There's not many people in the top 100, especially in the men's game, that are under 25, right?
Yeah.
But how many of them started playing when they were like 5? A lot. So it's early to specialize, but late to realize. So it's one of those sports where you've got to invest early and for a long period of time. So that's why a lot of people can't do it, because it costs a lot of money to do that.
Yeah. And I think, as we were saying earlier in the podcast, people's opinions shift one way, and it's almost like in strength and conditioning, you hear the word early specialization and immediately it's a negative thing, rather than, as you said, looking at it in the context of everything else and saying, actually, yes, we're specializing early. Yes, we're still going to develop these other physical qualities, but over time, it's that chunk of time that's going to lead to success later down the line. Like for me, I've always looked at it, whether or not you subscribe to the 10,000 hour rule. I always think if you start at the age of 5, it's much easier to get those 10,000 hours in sooner than, for example, if you start at 20 and then by the time you've done 10,000 hours, I don't know, you're 45 or the game has very much passed you by. Starting to wrap up now. If you were to recommend one resource, whether it's a podcast or a blog or maybe something online, what S&C resource would you recommend? Whether it's a person to follow, an actual resource, an app, whatever you've found useful.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I can just pull out a few people,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, in terms of podcast resources, you know that I'm a big fan of Pacey Performance podcast, and I know you've listened to that as well. So I do enjoy that. There's get a lot of diverse speakers on that. In terms of like thought provokers, people that make me really question things. Uh, Obviously, we mentioned Stefan Jones, so he'd be worth a follow on Instagram for sure, because he'll get your brain working. And then in terms of like a resource, a textbook that will, I wouldn't say it's a light read by any stretch of the imagination, but the book by Vergashansky, I really like the the special strength training for coaches manual, which is definitely not a light read, and it's probably more on the advanced level, but for just getting you to think about how to build the progressive training stimuli, with a foundation of movement efficiency and inter and intramuscular coordination, then strength, and then power, and then power endurance. A lot of my inspiration for the APA training method was taken from great sports scientists like Vergashansky, and I'd certainly have a look at that one if you can give it some time. And then probably last one, Franz Bosch, which we didn't mention today, but the strength training and coordination and integrated approach. I mean, that one again, if you want to really listen to some thought leaders and people that are going to challenge the norm, then that's another great book. That again, it's not a light read. You're probably going to need to read it several times, but those books and those people and those podcasts are definitely people and places that I revisit regularly to keep challenging my thoughts.
And you mentioned obviously how these books have influenced the APA framework. Where can people go to either get in touch with you personally or find out more about the services that yourself and APA provide?
Yeah, so I'm most active probably on Instagram. So my tag there is at APA Coach Daz. And as far as the website, there's a website, www.athleticperformanceacademy.co.uk. And again, I'm happy for people to email me as well. So you can email me at daz@apacoaching.co.uk.
Excellent. And last question, putting you on the spot a little bit now. If listeners, so whether it's tennis coaches, parents, or other S&C coaches, if they were to take one thing away from this podcast, what would you like that to be? And I know we've spoken about a lot, so you can have a couple of minutes on that one if you want.
There's a lot of stuff in there, but I think if I could speak more to the coach that is coming through and the young Daz, if I had my time again, it's still relevant to everyone, but I think I'm really speaking to that person, my younger self. I'd say get used to the words "it depends," because my life, my early career would have been a lot more kind of less stressful if I could just get my head around that word, or those words, I should say. It depends, because I really think that if we can start to see the world of strength conditioning and probably life in general, which is very philosophical, but there isn't necessarily going to always be a very black and white answer to the question. I think there's always going to be a bit of grey, and if you can get used to the that kind of mindset of it depends, you'll have a lot less stress in your coaching life.
Perfect place to end it. Just want to say thanks very much for giving up your evening to chat, Daz. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I know I rambled on at times, so it's always a test for me to articulate my inner workings of my brain. But hopefully, if you can get past the rambling, you maybe get a few things out of that.
Oh, absolutely. And as I said, I'll put links to the APA framework where people can find you and all the recommended resources we've mentioned in the show notes. Thanks very much once again, Daz.
My pleasure. Take care.
See you, mate.